The following is a real recording of a real coaching session. If you're interested in getting some coaching yourself, you can find the link in the description. Thanks and enjoy the video. So we've got obviously a couple different hands that have come up recently. Did you want to start with the three-way hand or do you want to start with the pocket sevens hand?
Uh, Either one. I think the pocket seventh hand, excuse me, I think the pocket seventh hand is, well, I was going to say it's easier, but now I'm not so sure based on the short discussion we had.
Sure. Yeah. I think that let's start with the sevens hand because it's heads up, right? Like, because it's a little bit simpler to discuss. And because I think it kind of taps into a little bit of what I think is one of the important things to talk through, which is just the idea that we want to avoid going down that rabbit hole of trying to predict actions that are going to take place, because there's so much scope of the potential of what those could be, right? And so the basic thing that we want to kind of get into the habit of is looking at in any given situation, what's the actual range that we're up against, and how do we build a strategy against that range that is going to fit with what the priorities are of what we're doing. And ideally, it's going to give us multiple options with different hands within our range. And I think the essence of maybe the problem that we run into with this pocket tens hand is that the small bet size on turn is a size that, like I mentioned on Discord, villain can quite comfortably look at that size and attribute, okay, that's not a bluff. Like immediately, it's just not a bluff, because it doesn't make any logical sense that you would you would use that size as a bluff, right? And as soon as that is possible for even a reasonably, like even a sort of a recreational player who's not very studied, things like that, there's a surprising amount of potential adaptations that villain can make that end up costing you money. And I think in this case, what's kind of interesting is villain called turn and then villain called river, right? So I actually think in this line, the frequency that villain just calls turn, calls river with a 10 is probably a lot higher than you would expect, simply because there's a couple different factors. I think that any 10 that has a pretty weak kicker, like 10-9 suited, Jack 10 suited, something like that, I think when you bet that turn for any size, I think any 10 with a weak kicker is going to be at least a little apprehensive about losing to a better 10, because that's just how people think. And it is honestly not, it's not a completely unreasonable thing to just not auto stack off with a 10 there. And then the other part of it is that in a lot of cases, people are likely to think that they are trapping you, right? And so they are going to do the same thing that you're doing, which is avoiding aggressively putting in a lot of money when they actually have good hands. And that's how so many low stakes hands end up with two absurdly strong hands playing a very small pot against each other, because both players are trying to trap the other one. And that is kind of my instinct about what might have actually happened here. I think villain probably did have had a 10 a decent chunk of the time. Maybe they end up calling river with like a king X of spades, right? Because the flop had 2 spades on it. So something like a flush draw that river to king is a potential river calling hand. But you have pocket sevens. So when it does go check bet call turn, king river check, reasonably big bet, you bet like pot on the river, right? I think so.
Yeah, a little less pot, basically pot.
Yeah. So pot on the river and then call. It's really hard to see what villain had other than specifically king X of spades or a 10. And both of those categories of hands are hands that, if like really, they should be getting stacked in this spot. What should be happening is you bet larger on turn, they call, river comes off the same card, you shove, they call, right? So that's kind of the thing that happened here, is you're both trying to trap each other. And in the end, the money doesn't go in. So we kind of have to pull out of that desire to trap and the desire to induce them to put the money in and just focus on putting the money in ourselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, because, yeah, I mean, I think that is unlikely that we were trapping each other in this case. I think if villain has a 10, I'm uncapped. Like, if I think villain is thinking, well, we talked about this a lot. Don't think so much what villain is thinking. This is like one of your common things that you say to me. Yeah, villain is thinking, oh, I'm about to stack his pocket aces or his pocket kings or pocket queens all of which are in my range, but are not in her range. And so she thinks she's just hit the jackpot. I mean, the chances that I have a 10, certainly in my range, but if she's got a 10, I mean, I am thinking that most villains would be rushing to get stacks in there.
Well, I think the deciding factor here is I think most villains are going to make the assumption that you wouldn't bet aces, kings, or queens on the turn because the 10 is such an inherently scary card for those hands. I think that's the logic that a lot of low stakes players are going to use there. And I think the other sort of part of the equation is that it quite often is possible to look back at a situation and say, okay, well, based on what actually took place, what logical assumptions are we going to make about the range that we're likely up against, or what logical assumptions about what villain could be thinking. And if that was true on the turn, that villain is looking at a 10 as like, okay, I have a 10, it's basically the nuts. Then what we're saying there is that villain's range for the line that they actually took, which is check call turn, check call pot on river, is basically exactly king X of spades. Because when you have pocket sevens and that exact line happens, there's just nothing else that villain can have that actually takes that line, right? So either they actually did play a 10 a bit less aggressively than you might expect, or maybe they exactly had king X of spades potentially. But I think one way or another, the thing that's kind of important, I suppose, is that we don't look at each individual spot purely through the lens of what we're doing when we actually have value. And what's also important on that turn is that because of the size that you used, because it's a size that, based on the range that villain actually has in that situation, it's a size that basically never gets a fold. Like you pretty much have 0 folds that you get in that circumstance because there's no hands that have the price that are getting the price that they can fold. So even if we make all the assumptions that we need to in order to make that a size that does result in us getting stacks in when we have a set of sevens or when we turn a full house, the problem is that it still becomes a situation where if we were to use that turn size as a bluff, we would get no folds ever. And that's a problem because we want to at least occasionally be in situations where we can successfully bluff on a turn card like that, right? So we want to be able to build a strategy that's functional, not just for the value hands in our range, but that also is functional for bluffs. Because I want us to move out of this trend where every hand you post is a value hand. And we're not really able to talk about hands where you're bluffing because I never find out about them. Because right now, 80 to 90% of the hands you post are value hands. The ace six hand, it's a value hand. The pocket sevens hand, it's a value hand. The pocket queens hand, it's a value hand.
So I've been running hot. Most of the hands I get are value hands.
The thing about it is
I'm
obviously
joking.
yeah, of course. I mean, it's natural that when you're running hot, like you're going to get dealt a lot of value hands. But I feel like we've been working together a long time, and I feel like I still don't have a lot of clarity on what kind of bluff lines you're taking because we talk about so few hands where you have bluffs, right? So I want to start looking at these hands through the lens of bluffs. And in particular, that pocket sevens hand is a turn size where it's not a bluff. And villain recognizes it's not a bluff, right? Villain recognizes that one way or another, you just wouldn't use that turn size with any hand that was hoping to get a fold. And that's kind of where this hand kind of goes off the rails a little bit. In terms of the turn size, in terms of how we actually build a well-rounded strategy there, we have to think about when villain continues beyond flop against the flop size that we use, which was, I think, about half pot. There's an argument for going bigger on flop, but it's not a huge deal one way or the other. What we want is to figure out the range of hands that we're up against on the turn, which is, first of all, of course, villain can have a 10. Villain can have a 7. Villain can have a flush draw. Villain can have a straight draw, and so on. So we want to identify what portion of range we're going to be able to target and build a strategy around. We're building a strategy around putting a certain portion of villain's range in a tough spot. Now, naturally, we can't really put a 10 in a tough spot. Excuse me. We can't put a 10 in a tough spot between folding and continuing because a 10 is too strong. So we forget about a 10. the next category down is a 7. And can we put a 7 in a spot where it's a tough decision between continuing and folding? Maybe, yeah, because a 7 is a decently strong hand here, but some of the 7x the hands they're going to have are like 7-6, where they have no kicker, like the kicker doesn't play or something like that, and they get crushed by an overpair. They have 2 outs against an overpair, and they're dead against the 7. So we might be able to build a strategy that puts a 7 in a tough spot. Can we build a strategy that puts a flush draw or a straight draw in a tough spot? Yeah, we can. We can certainly give villain a lot of decisions where on a paired board like this, when they have flush draws, when they have straight draws, they're going to have some awkward decisions about whether or not to continue. But versus that 50, I think it was like quarter pot on the turn basically there, versus that size, nothing has a tough spot. So the size that I think is going to make the most sense there is something in the region of like 3/4 pot, something that causes a 7 to be in that spot of like, oh, I really don't feel good about calling here, but I kind of have to. And something that causes a flush draw to think about, okay, I have a flush draw, but the board is paired, or something like that. That sort of size is going to give villain tougher spots. And it's going to allow us to actually select a range that is well-rounded and includes bluffs that are going to be able to really take advantage of being able to pick up pots without showdown. And of course, if we pick the bluffs correctly, we're also going to have situations where we bluff the turn, villain calls, they check the river, we shove the river, and now they fold. And now we picked up a pretty big size pot without showdown. But in this case, on this particular turn, even if we construct a perfect betting range for that particular turn size, our bluffing decisions get very complicated because we use the turn size that villain just doesn't fold to. So I think a larger turn size would function well for that.
We bet half pot on the turn, or just under half pot, not quarter pot.
Didn't you bet? I want to check on the hand history. Oh, you bet 100? Okay.
Yeah. Did I post it wrong?
Did I? Yeah, you said bet 50. Oh, okay. So you meant bet 50%. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. That's a little bit different. Okay. So that definitely makes the turn a little bit more viable, but I still think it's too small. Sorry, because you said bet 50 on the turn.
I said bet $50 and then I said bet 50%. So
right.
Okay.
That's why I got confused. But so that does make it better. Half pot is definitely better than quarter pot on the turn, but it's still probably not big enough because I think it's still kind of in the territory where a 7 has a pretty trivial call and not like a close call. And I think a flush draw, like most of the flush draws are still calling. The straight draws, like the weakest straight draws, are probably folding. But I think we're getting closer to the right kind of size. But I think we can still go bigger. And I think in particular, the general idea here is we want to make sure that a 7 starts to feel a bit uncomfortable. It starts to feel like I can't really fold, but I want to continue, or I don't feel great about continuing. The other thing to note as well is that pocket 7s is a completely reasonable hand to check the turn with, because full houses are some of our best sort of trappy hands that are potentially going to just be able to jam the river on every single river, no matter what happens. And so having a strategy where we bet a largish size with a fairly polar range, and we're trying to put a 7 in a tough spot. But then when we specifically have pocket 7s and we block all the 7s, now we check, and we have that hand as like the hand that's protecting our range, the hand that's basically planning to jam every single river when facing a bet. That's also reasonable. So if you had checked this turn, I would have said, okay, we don't want to get too trappy, but checking is actually fine. Checking is actually better than betting small here, which is kind of interesting. But obviously half pot is, again, reasonable. It's just, I think we want to shift a bit more into thinking about, we're trying to give villain tough spots so that we can construct a well-rounded range for ourselves. And in this particular case, if we had gone quarter pot, it would have been really hard to think about like what bluffs are we going to have, because nothing's getting a fold. And when we do bet half pot, it's a little bit more viable, but it's still a little bit hard to think about what's the region of hands that villain's actually folding here, other than stuff that's really quite weak. Does that make sense?
Well, this lends to a theory question too.
Sure.
So,
okay.
So you're saying we want to bet an amount that's going to put things like flush draws in a tough spot.
Mm-hmm.
Now, our hand has a flush draw drawing stone cold dead. I mean,
Yep.
so if we bet and a flush draw folds, that's really bad for us.
It is.
Uh,
But
so
I'm not saying that I'm not saying that we're trying to make a flush draw fold. I'm saying that we're trying to get a flush draw to put in the maximum amount of money without folding. You see what I mean? Not what we're trying to get a flush draw, a 7. We're trying to get all these hands in a position where they're thinking about folding, and maybe they actually do fold sometimes. But for our specific hand, the goal is to get them to put in the most amount of money. It's not necessarily just to make sure that they don't fold. Because the problem is that sometimes they make a flush on the river in a small pot and they find a reason to not stack off. So let's say we check the turn with a full house. One of the downsides of checking the turn with a full house is maybe they make a flush on the river, they bet and we jam and they say, oh, the board is paired, and they decide to fold a flush, right? But if we bet and they call and they put a good amount of money into the pot on the turn and the SPR by the river is quite low, then now when they make their flush, they never fold it, right? We just stack them every time. So we have to consider that element of it as well. And it is true that there are going to be times where our individual hand loses out by the fact that they fold a flush draw. But at the same time, we also have to consider that our individual hand benefits from the times that they have something else other than a flush draw, right? There's only a certain amount of flush draws in their range. There's not that much of those hands that's ever going to be in there. So it's always trade-offs. It's always pros and cons. And of course, when we actually have a bluff, if we have a bluff here and they fold a flush draw, that's great, right? If we have a bluff and they fold a flush draw, we win the pot and they folded a bunch of equity, right?
Right.
We always have to consider that every range should be constructed from the perspective of we're going to have bluffs a bunch of the time here. And if we start building ranges from the perspective of just, okay, I'm going to build a range for my value hands, and then I'm not even going to think about bluffs, now we just end up playing a super value heavy strategy, which is not that difficult to beat. So that's kind of where we want to go with this. We want to think about, yes, it's true that sometimes when you have the top of your range and villain folds a hand that was drawing dead against it, maybe that's a downside, right? But you're gonna have the top of your range so rarely, and you're gonna have bluffs a lot more often. And it's probably more important here to make sure that we have the ability to put them in a tough spot when we're actually bluffing, as opposed to purely just looking at how do we make sure that when we have value, they just never fold anything. Because if we try to go down the route of I have value and the last thing I want is for my opponent to fold any hand in their range, that's how we end up playing super trappy and doing too much checking and too much small betting and various things like that, right? The main thing here in this particular spot is we have to ensure that we stack a 10 at the absolute highest frequency. And generally that's going to revolve around, with our value range, betting slightly bigger on the turn. And then of course that also allows us to be bluffing a good chunk of the time here as well. And I really want to keep hammering home that idea of how we're constructing our bluffs and how we're actually implementing bluffing ranges here. Cause like I say, I feel like I have a really good sense of how you play when you have value, but I don't really feel like I have a lot of clarity on what bluff spots you're taking or missing, because so many of the hands that we end up talking about are hands where you just have it.
Well, I can share with you, I didn't post, but I did have a value bluff hand from that same section I can share with you.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. But I guess before we leave this hand, I guess at the time I was thinking, I think I posted this, essentially small bet or small-ish bet, half pot bet on kind of doesn't lose much, or if our opponent has a big hand because they're going to raise, and it loses a lot if they have a poor hand because they're going to fold. They have a small pocket pair, or they have, something, a 7-8, something that's just not very good there. So I sort of I don't see that. I don't see much upside to the smallish, to betting higher, because if they've got a great hand, we're going to stack them either way. If they've got a poor hand, we're going to get more money by betting small.
Well, what about if they have a medium hand? Like, you just skipped over medium hands altogether. Like, we've ignored the category of medium hands. That's the problem.
Well, I guess I was putting medium hand. I would consider 7-8 or pocket 8s a medium hand.
That's the issue here, right? those hands have way more equity than you would think in this situation. The only time those hands become like weak hands that are just going to fold this turn is if you're drastically under bluffing, which might be the reality just based on that analysis. But the thing about it here is that villain should be looking at pocket eights here as a hand that's like, okay, I don't beat any value here, but I beat every bluff. Therefore, I have a medium strength hand that probably is only going to fold if I face a really big bet, or if I think villain is drastically under bluffing, right? If your opponent is looking at pocket eights and going, well, I have pocket eights, I have a weak hand here, and they're just undervaluing pocket eights, that means your bluffs are absolutely printing, because pocket eights probably has, against your range, pocket eights might have 50 to 60% equity here, or it should do. And if they're folding a hand that's that strong, you're absolutely running them over with your bluffs, and they are drastically overfolded. So this is kind of the missing element here. Even just cognitively, the way that you framed that kind of concept, the way that you went, okay, they've got good hands and they're going to stack off, or they've got bad hands and they're going to fold. If that was the case, and your opponent's range is kind of polarized in that sense, then the strategy of having a lot of small bets would actually make a lot of sense. But the thing about it is your opponent has a ton of hands that are pretty medium strength here. And if you play, if they perceive you to be playing super value heavy, those hands go down in value, obviously. But if you play the way that we would want to play on the earlier streets, we're now putting them in a position where if they just fold a 7 here, they're getting absolutely run over. And same goes for if they fold like a strong flush draw or something like that, because a 7 is so high up in their range at this point in comparison to other hands. Like it's really hard for them to have that many hands that are better than a 7 or better than pocket eights in this kind of situation, right? Maybe only 20 to 30% of their range is better than those hands, which is just a 10 basically, or probably even less than that, honestly. If they are folding 70, 80% of the time, or they're folding a hand that's that high up in their range to your turn barrel, then they are getting crushed and they cannot win in this game, period. So one of those things has to be happening. Either they are doing that, in which case we should be bluffing significantly more often than what the solver would suggest us to do, because they are drastically overfolding. Or, in fact, what they have is a lot of medium hands. We're kind of ignoring a lot of these hands that have in that middle region of 40, 50, 60% equity in situations like this, or that have the kind of level of equity where they are bluff catching and they can hold on the turn and hope that we just give up on a bluff on the river. And, we're not really putting them in enough tough spots. I did actually run kind of an approximated version of this spot. So let me just share my screen real quick and show you the version that I ran. It's not an ideal sort of adaptation, but what I want is to just showcase a little bit how much. Let's see. Okay, there we hide the controls. I just ran it with like 3-bet pot ranges, sort of as if you were 3-betting and they were calling the 3-bet, which is, it's not super accurate, but it's close enough. And then I also had them, I locked their flop check call range to be, very value heavy with their check raises and, maybe not check raising at 10 very often. When we get to the turn card here, which I put the 10 of clubs, if we look at the equities of different hands in the ranges, first of all, we have way more very good hands than they do. And of course, they do have a lot of pretty weak hands. But if we look at the distribution and the equity of different hands in their range, pocket eights, 58% equity here, right? On this turn card 10, 58%. 7-6, 55%, right? Even, well, 8-7 as well, 56%, right? And if they were folding hands that are that strong, then we get to absolutely run them over. Now, I did run a bunch of different sizes for us here, and the size that it wants to go with is basically kind of a mix between around 70% and around just under pot on the turn here. So it doesn't really like the small sizes. And again, it's basically putting that 7x region, or like pocket 9s, pocket 8s are indifferent here. Pocket 9s and 8s are close between call and fold. 7-6 is actually pure call, or close to it, which is a little interesting. It's just going to be on account of blockers and things like that, probably. But bottom line here is those hands against our range, if we're playing, an appropriate range, those hands should be very strong. Those hands should have more than 50% equity here. And if we were to, plug in a response where they actually ended up folding those hands, it would, well, maybe if I lock in and say, okay, like they're going to fold 100% with second pair, let's say, third pair, low pair, under pair, like if they fold all that stuff, just lock them into folding that. It's now going to really, it's going to, first of all, want us to bet 70% probably a lot more often. Oh, 33%. Okay. I guess it's probably because we've got so many different sizings here. And yeah, it's okay. So it's wanting them to compensate by raising more often. And okay, so it's too complex of a spot to really lock it effectively. But bottom line here is that those 8x hands have way more equity than you think against a range that is betting. We're probably pretty much range betting. Oh, we're not actually range betting in this sim. That's interesting. But anyway, against the range that we're betting the flop with, they may have a little bit less if we're just range betting, but they're strong hands here, right? They're not hands that are looking to stack off, but a hand like pocket nines is not a hand that can easily justify folding when there are only a certain number of hands in the range that are actually better than pocket nines at this point. Even a hand like ace queen high, ace queen of hearts has, what was it? Ace queen of hearts has 42% equity here because ace high is just beating so many of our bluffs that bluff the flop. So it ultimately comes down to, if they are folding these hands, we should absolutely just rampantly bluff as much as we can possibly get away with. But if they're not, then now we have plenty of additional stuff that we can actually extract value from by betting these kinds of sizes with the value portions of our range, right? So it kind of goes both ways. Either we bluff a ton or we can just get much more value than we would think. It can't really be neither of those two things. You see what I mean? Yeah. So that's kind of the way that I would look at this. I think we want to really focus on, in situations like that, recognizing that it's not necessarily very often going to be the case that we can divide villains' range between, well, they have strong stuff that's going to stack off, and then they have weak stuff that's just going to fold if I bet. And it kind of seems to me like that sort of evaluation, even though it's probably not inaccurate in the sense that if your opponent perceives you to be very value heavy, that might not be a bad way to play. That evaluation is possibly what's leading you down this pathway of, when I have really strong hands, they're going to stack off no matter what. And then when they have really strong hands, they're going to stack off no matter what. And then when they have anything else other than that, they're just not going to put more chips in the pot. I think what we want is to really highlight and identify those middle portions of villain's range that are medium kind of equity, 50%-ish on the turn. How do we put those hands, those bluff catchers, in spots that are really tough? And how do we give them the most difficult decisions that we can? Because in most spots, particularly on the turn, that's kind of the key. That's how we build a well-rounded strategy. And it's also how we open up lines that allow us to get to the river and have enough bluffs in our range that we can jam the river and get a fold and win a big pot without showdown, right? Because that's what we want. So that's kind of I think the one sort of holistic shift that we would want to make. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I am, just based on what you said, I'm counting villains bluff. I'm not giving villains bluff catchers enough strength. I mean, these aren't hands where I can just sort of barely get a couple more big blinds out of. These are hands that I can bet more on. So, I mean, that pair of eights example is perfect. I mean, I was thinking this is the most I can get out of a pair of eights. I hear you saying, in fact, you can get more out of a pair of eights.
The crucial thing is you can get more out of a pair of eights if villain perceives you to be playing aggressively enough that they have an incentive to continue with a pair of eights, right? The hard part about that is kind of the thing that people always wonder about is, they want to be able to be perceived to be playing this super aggressive style where people are bluff catching them a lot, but they don't want to actually have to play that way. And there's not really any way to resolve that, unfortunately. Like, in order to be perceived to be playing that way, you have to actually play that way. And the good thing about it is that playing that way makes a lot of money. So that's kind of the direction that we want to shift in, obviously. And it's also just you just kind of recognizing the width of ranges in various situations. Even if you were to just look at situations where you arrive at a flop that is pretty favorable for you and you range bet the flop, in any given situation, there's going to be so many hands that you bet the flop with that are part of your pre-flop range, but maybe weren't particularly strong on a certain board, that they're going to be relatively weak. And when your opponent calls the flop, quite often, what's going to happen is maybe they have some weak hands here and there, or they have some hands that are, speculative or something like that. But if they have a hand that at least has one pair, and then they face a small flop bet from a reasonably wide range and they continue, even like bottom pair, by the time you get to the turn, a lot of the time is going to have, 40% equity. Just having a pair is going to give quite a bit of equity to that range. And if we looked at what would happen in this particular spot, in theory, we sort of saw the pocket eights, pocket nines there were kind of indifferent on the turn versus that bet size. What's probably supposed to happen,
and that bet they were indifferent to like 75%.
Yeah, exactly. What's likely supposed to happen there in theory is you could see that the eights or nines were indifferent, probably partially because they're blocking some of your bluffs. But something like 7-6 was a pure call because it's not blocking any bluffs. And in theory, what's probably supposed to happen is that nines and eights mix on the turn, and then on the river, nines and eights, theoretically, they do beat your bluffs, but they're probably going to be bad bluff catchers, so they just fold on the river. But 7-6 is a hand that theoretically, when they call the turn and then the river bricks off, we should be able to shove the river and have them at least consider calling with 7-6. That's what's theoretically correct in that spot if we're bluffing at the right frequency, because 7-6 is a hand that on a blank river, on a king river, which mostly is a blank, 7-6 is going to beat all of our bluffs and lose to all of our value bets. And ideally, when villain gets to the river in a spot with a hand that fits that exact description, we want to put them in a situation where they have a really tough decision. And in the end, sometimes we're going to be able to estimate, okay, I think this player is going to fold all their bluff catchers, so I'm just going to bluff everything. And sometimes maybe we think, okay, in this spot, I don't think they're going to fold any bluff catchers, so we just give up on our bluffs. But loosely speaking, if we can get to the river in a situation where we have a polar range that can put a bluff catcher in a tough spot, that's going to be the route to putting everybody in tough spots and just printing in the long run. So that's kind of what we're aiming for here. And that, the starting point for that is being able to find a lot of turn bluffs, obviously, to make sure villain has an incentive to continue with those eights and nines and 7-6 and stuff like that. Make sense? Okay, cool. So let's talk about the three-way hand, because I thought that was a really interesting one. And I think it touches on a couple of the same concepts, because I think that where it starts to, in a vacuum, the line that you took, bet, flop, shove, turn, it's not going to be a disaster by any means. But I think that the hand kind of starts with an evaluation of the flop where it's not a particularly great situation for us as the big blind three better. And there's a pretty good argument there for just checking everything on the flop three ways first to act, because there's just a lot of situations, especially monotone flops. There's a lot of situations where three ways first to act is just really, really difficult to build any kind of a reasonable value betting range from out of position first to act. And anytime that's the case, it's quite nice to just check everything, because then we don't ever have to make a decision about which hands we're going to bluff with, which hands we're going to value bet, and things like that. We just check everything and we move from there. So talk me through the kind of evaluation that you had when we go to the flop three ways there. We're up against kind of one player that you said sort of was a kind of a European, sort of maybe potentially a pro, raised to 2.5x pre, so that could be more of a pro. And then you've also got kind of a shorter stack. Like, what are we thinking when we get to that flop?
So when we get to the flop, I'm thinking, first I have the backdoor draw. So an overpair and a backdoor draw. So my hand is pretty good here. And given the depth of the poor player, there's no way I'm folding any hand. And so I'm not any hand. We should fold like. Well, I'm not holding this hand. Sorry, I'm not holding.
Of course, yeah.
Hand. And so if I bet and he jams, I snap call it.
Of course.
Any question.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I meant. To any sizing, I guess I should say.
Yeah.
So I'm still quite concerned about the pro, because he's deep and because he was the raiser. So he's gonna more better hands.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, part of my thought, and maybe this is bad thinking, or this is bad thinking, was I want to bet and pre-flop raiser, he's in a bad position because he is squeezed between the two of us. He's
I
not
mean,
last to act.
I mean that, yeah, that's kind of true. It's kind of not. The reason why it's kind of true is because you're right. Obviously is a player left to act behind, but the thing is that the player left to act behind is shorter stacked, which means that inherently the deeper stacked player doesn't have to worry as much about them for the same reason that you don't have to worry as much about them. And then the other thing here that's quite important is he has position on you, which inherently, because you have to play against him out of position, it gives him a lot more ability to realize equity against you. And since you two are the deeper two, that's kind of what I would be prioritizing here. The fact that you're out of position against the deeper stack. If this was a different formation and you, for example, you had a shorter stack in position on you and then a deeper stack out of position against you, that would certainly change this hand a fair amount. And it's just because we're first to act three ways that I think we're going to default to doing a ton of checking in a lot of spots. And on this particular flop texture, that's kind of where I would go. But yeah, sorry, carry on with what you were evaluating.
Yeah. Okay. So what I was thinking is, I feel my hand is strong enough to bet, even though it's a monotone flop, and even it's monotone flop three-way. And I want to bet enough that the under the gun player sort of has to take it quite seriously. That it's not, I don't want to give him a trivial call with a marginal hand because I'm going to have trouble playing against that range out of position.
Okay, so let's talk about that idea, right? What hands in the undergun player's range? Let's say you were to bet very small here. So let's say you were to bet quarter pot, which is not even that small, but let's say you were to bet quarter pot here. What hands in the under the gun player's range have a trivial call to the point where what are you thinking about when you say I don't want to give them a trivial call with a marginal hand?
He has 9-8 of hearts, then he'll call a tiny bet with a pair in position.
Okay. If we have pocket queens, why do we not want him to call with that hand?
Well, I guess we do want to call, but it makes it very difficult for me to play deep out of position against a capable player. Then what am I going to do on the turn? If the turn is blank.
So here's where your logic is falling down, right? And I can already sort of sense it, is that on the one hand, you're recognizing that you're out of position, you're deep stacked, you're against a pretty capable player. And on the other hand, you're betting and putting more money in the pot in that situation, out of position against a capable player at deep stacks. And you're matching those two things together and using one to justify the other. And I think what it comes down to is when you bet, sometimes he folds and you don't have to play the turn. And that's the main thing that's going through your mind making this decision. And as soon as you start to think, okay, well, I have a value hand, but I want my opponent to fold a worse hand, that's a cue that something's going wrong there, right? Because you're on the right track to begin with. You're on the right line thinking about we're deep stacked, he's a good player, we're out of position. All of those things are very relevant, but they should lead you to just say, I'm never going to bet anything here, instead of saying, I'm going to bet this hand and hopefully he folds a bunch of marginal hands, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess a part of it, I mean, and I'm sure it's going to say it's the same thing, but then if he raises my bet, then that's quite defining for him. I mean, he's not, then he's very strong. If I bet if I bet a moderate size like I did, and he raises me, then I probably call, but I'm probably not putting more money in the pot absent a good turn card.
Okay. Now, when we're talking about getting raised, we're talking about a thing that happens probably like less than 10% of the time. And just it may not happen at all. What hands is he actually raising there? We have to think about the actual raising range that he could potentially have, and not just a sort of generalized idea of, if he raises, he's probably very strong. Because ultimately, if it's true that he's raising a very strong range, you shouldn't just call that raise with queens with the queen of spades. If it's true that he's raising a very strong range on this flop, you're probably drawing almost dead against that range because it's flushes and it's pocket aces with a spade and things like that, right? So we're going down a rabbit hole of trying to create a specific set of circumstances. And all of it really comes back to wanting to have more clarity about what his range looks like.
Yes.
Right. It all
Yes,
comes
that's
back
exactly
to,
right. That's exactly right. Yes,
it
I bet
all
this
comes
size because
yeah.
I wanted clarity about. Yeah,
Yeah.
I would say if you were asked me, was it to get him to fold? No, I bet to get clarity about his range,
Right. And
no
that's
matter
the
what
problem.
that was.
That's the problem. That's the issue that we're dealing with here. Because the more we go down that rabbit hole of wanting clarity, the more we're starting to get to the point of we're betting for information, which basically leads to when he calls, I know I have the worst hand. When he folds, I know I had the best hand. And the other thing about it is that you also get information by checking. This is another thing that's really important, right? People look at betting for information. If you check, you also get information, because when you check, he has to take an action. And when he takes an action, he has a range that takes that action. When he checks on the flop, that tells you something about the nature of his range. If he bets a massive size on the flop, that tells you something. If he bets a small size, that tells you something. There's all sorts of things that tell you something about his range. So you don't inherently get any more information from betting than you do by checking. It's just that when you bet, you have the comforting factor of sometimes he just folds and you win the pot and you don't have to make any further decisions, right? The reason why people struggle in these situations is because checking inherently means no matter what, I'm going to have to make at least one more decision in this spot.
It's true.
And it's physically uncomfortable sometimes to be in a situation where it's like I'm exposing myself to more of this spot. And so people bet because they know that at least if they bet, there's a good chance that maybe both these guys just fold and I just win this pot and I don't have to deal with this spot anymore. But when we check, there's a certainty I know I'm going to have to deal with this spot. Now, in this particular situation, it is true that when you check, under the gun is going to put you in some difficult spots. But it's also, I think that's the exact reason why it makes sense to check your entire range here and not check some hands and bet some hands. Because if you check some hands and bet some hands, then the under the gun player is pretty likely to recognize that when you check this flop, you basically just never have anything remotely good and he just gets to automatically win the pot, right? If he's a vaguely competent player, he's going to recognize that. When you check your entire range, your range is now protected. Your range maintains the ability to navigate across multiple streets. And you also, crucially, when you're out of position, you get to cater to low frequency instances more easily. So let's say something happens where you check, under the gun bets, and then the short stack shoves all in. Well, now you have a lot more opportunity to make decisions based on those specific two ranges than if you were to bet and then it goes call and the short stack shoves and obviously you have to call and then the other guy calls. And now you're going three ways to the turn with a player all in and there's already a certain amount of money in the pot and everything gets much more complicated from that point onwards, right? Checking gets you just as much information as betting does, except it forces you to have to make more decisions. But making more decisions is what you want. Making more decisions and forcing your opponent to play more streets is what you want, because that's how we have an edge in this game. If you want to get chips in on the earlier streets more frequently, then there are going to be situations where that's fine, especially situations where the board texture is likely to change a lot in ways that are unfavorable for your range. But in particular, when, first of all, the board texture in this particular case is not likely to change that much because a flush is not going to somehow get worse on the turn very often. The board texture is going to stay pretty much the same. You're up against tight ranges. And a lot of the time when you do bet, especially if you bet with a value heavy range, the problem is that the hands that fold are hands that were drawing virtually dead against your value range, right? So if you, let's say you were to bet with just, if the only hands on the flop that you bet are over pairs with a spade, the majority of the hands that fold to that bet size on the flop are like pocket eights with a spade, right? Which was drawing basically stone dead. And that's a real problem. When your value range is making hands fold that are crushed, it's a real problem. And of course, when you're betting 40% into two players on this board, basically the only specific hand that you can bluff with is ace king or ace queen with the ace of spades, or maybe the king of spades, maybe the queen of spades even. But you basically can't ever have a bluff without a spade. You can't really bet like ace king of hearts for that size here, which means that as soon as you bet and somebody calls and the turn's a spade, well, now there's no bluffs anymore, right? We just can't bluff. And so to avoid that, to avoid narrowing down our range on the earlier street in that kind of a way, checking your entire range, not only does it fulfill all these properties that we mentioned earlier on, but it also avoids having you navigate down any kind of a line where suddenly we have no bluffs left, right? We have no bluff candidates. So I think the missing ingredient there is just being willing to say, okay, I am going to have difficult decisions here once I check. This is going to be a difficult spot inherently. It just has to be. But it's also going to be a difficult spot if I bet. It's just going to be a different kind of a difficult spot. And there's not really any inherent information that we get from betting. And in fact, you kind of went through the process there of thinking about the types of hands that he's going to fold. The thing about it is, just to come back to that idea of indifference, when you bet the flop for this size and he folds, the majority of the hands that he's going to fold are going to be very weak. And that just makes life a lot easier on him. You know, a lot of his hands have pretty trivial continues and pretty trivial folds. And of course, that it doesn't help us necessarily. If we were going to bet here, it wouldn't be a disaster to bet here if we had bet a smaller size, like 20% pot or something, because he has a little bit more in the way of difficult decisions against that size. And it's more plausible that you might have been bluffing, because now you can at least have some hands that might bet that size and then fold if the short stack goes all in. But as soon as you bet a size that's big enough that you're committing against the short stack, now that can never be a pure bluff, right? It can never be like a low equity hand, like some suited connector that squeezed pre-flop and just has no equity on this board and is just c-betting as a bluff. It can't be that anymore. So you want to avoid those kinds of situations where a pretty decent player can look at your range and say, okay, this just can't be a bluff, because that just never makes it more difficult for them. It only makes it easier. That makes sense?
Yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah. And then on turn, you know, turn is sort of a separate thing, because I see what you were getting at in terms of your evaluation of what kind of strategy you can take with just having a range of like ace of spades hands and then some bluffs. But I think the question comes down to, if we're going to take that strategy, what portion of the under the gun player's range are we trying to make indifferent there, right? Like, what do we think is the portion that we're targeting? What hands does he have a tough decision with?
I think he has a tough decision with his overpair, if he, you know, in the rare, if he slow play, what does he have a tough decision? Not a lot. To be honest, he doesn't have a lot, but
There
the
you go.
range I gave him is quite narrow. I mean,
Yes.
so I don't think he'd have a lot of tough decisions against much. Yeah. So in the very rare case that he has slow played aces without a spade, which exists, I mean, it's extremely rare, but it exists.
It does exist.
Then that's a tough decision.
Yeah.
If he has, I mean, the range that I had him on at the end is quite narrow. I mean, I don't think I can give him a tough decision if he has, say, ace jack of hearts, which is top pair, top kicker on the flop, which is something he could very easily have. When the queen turns, which is now an overpair or an overcard, I don't think he's calling much. I mean, after all the aggression I've shown. So
I agree.
I don't think he's calling much at all.
I agree.
I don't think he has many tough decisions.
Yeah, I agree. I think that when you specifically run into a set of jacks or a set of nines, I think you stack him, obviously. But I think when you run into anything else, you win the pot without showdown, and you kind of tell yourself, okay, maybe he just had a bad hand. But in reality, he kind of got away from probably a pretty decent hand. And this is kind of the thing about the paradox of live poker, really, which is that people who play too tight or who are too value heavy never end up getting any evidence to show them the spots that they're missing out on, because you never see evidence of the type of hands your opponents are folding against you unless they specifically choose to show you that. But on the flip side, people who play way too aggro do get to see evidence of how wide their opponents are calling against them. So it's a lot easier to see a situation where you maybe made an aggro play and got called light and say, oh, I shouldn't have done that, I'm going to tighten up, than it is to say, I shouldn't have shoved here because I'm never getting called by worse, because you never get to find out that he snap folded ace jack of hearts or something here. And you never get to find out that maybe he made a big fold with kings with no spade, or aces with no spade, or something like this, right? Yeah, I think it's a situation where I can understand the logic behind the line, and I can understand, honestly, in a wider formation, if this was like cutoff versus button versus big blind, I could see this line making a lot more sense because, excuse me, because the opposition player might be able to have some two pairs that can call that are worse. Like he might have all three sets instead of just two of them. Like there might be a wider variety of stuff that you can actually get called by that's worse, and there would be potentially you would have a wider range, so you would have a lot more combinations of potential hands that could jam the turn as a bluff. But in this really narrow formation, the problem is it just isn't really feasible for you to put him in very many tough spots by jamming the turn, because so many of his hands just have a trivial fold, and then everything that's like a set or two pair or a flush or a straight, if it's low frequency, but it might be in there, all that stuff just snaps. So that's kind of the essence here, that if we
What
do bet
about,
that,
actually, I did come up with the one hand. The one hand that puts him in a tough spot, and this is, you kept asking why was I so obsessed with the ace of spades. If he has ace king with the ace of spades or the king of spades,
it is kind of a tough.
those are those are gut shot straight flush draws with two overs.
Yeah, I mean, those hands probably just call. Like it's an annoying spot, but it's not necessarily a tough spot because he's getting a pretty good price and he's got good equity. So like, you know what I mean? Like it's also relevant to consider that if your range on the turn for jamming is so heavy on overpairs that have a spade, it's actually almost impossible that that spot can actually exist. It requires you to specifically have pocket queens or pocket jacks in order for anything to happen where you jam the turn and he specifically has the ace of spades. So that the card removal aspects of that are so specific that it's almost impossible for that spot to even happen, because when he has the ace of spades, you just don't jam the turn very much, right? So it's just one of these things where anytime there's a very specific portion of villain's range that we're really honed in on, and we kind of can't see the forest for the trees sort of thing, we end up taking lines that maybe in the big picture of giving villain tough spots make a lot less sense. So if we did bet this size on the flop, on the turn, I think with this specific hand, the reason the solver wants to check it is because when we have the queen of spades, it's just very specifically very difficult for us to get called by anything, because we're blocking like ace queen with a spade and stuff like that. And so there's just going to be some odd stuff that goes on with card removal there. But I think that in general, if we were going to bet this turn, we would probably have to bet a bit smaller, just specifically to be able to say, okay, I want to bet a size that's going to put ace jack of hearts in a tough spot. I want to bet small here so that ace jack of hearts at least has to think about whether to continue or not. And then maybe hands like jack 10 are also in a tough spot there, right? Hands like the ace king with the ace of spades has to decide between, do I shove as a bluff or do I call? There's things like that that are happening there that if you bet small on the turn, it kind of compensates for the flop bet. But the easiest way to navigate this hand is to check everything on the flop, and then you don't ever have to construct a betting range for the flop or the turn. And a lot of those tough decisions actually get neutralized by the fact that you're not playing that line, and the flop is going to get checked around a lot anyway. So the way this hand is probably going to play out a lot of the time is either you check under the gun bets, you call and you turn a set and maybe you check raise the turn or something, or you check and maybe under the gun just checks back and then the cutoff checks back, and you just go three ways to a turn and you still have your entire range, but both of them are a little bit more capped. And so you have a lot more opportunity to play with interest, like a nice level of information there, right? So checking does give you that information that if you check and they check back, they're quite often going to be very capped. So that's another example of betting does give you some level of information, but it doesn't actually give you more than what checking does, right? Yeah. So I would take that approach. And I think that, yeah, going forward, I want to just continue putting energy into how we're selecting bluffs and really just looking at every hand through the lens of being able to pick up more bluffing opportunities, because like I say, I do think you might be right about the types of hands that your opponents are folding in some of these situations. You know, they might be folding the pocket eights on the 10-7-5 or 10-7-4. And if they are, we definitely have to find the bluffs in those lines because there's tons of opportunity to just exert more folds, exert more pressure. And you know,
Yeah.
there's a lot of important principles that we can kind of figure out there to, you know, to be able to discuss what our bluff candidates are in more detail. Make sense?
Okay. Yeah, I can tell. So I can tell you about this one bluff hand,
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
which I will be replaying from memory. So
Okay.
this could be
That's fine.
wrong. And it's also, I'm not sure it's instructive because it was such a unique thing involving this particular villain and his
Hmm.
chefing. Fine. So I'm in the blind. I can't remember if I'm the big blind or the small blind with ace king off.
Okay.
Folds around to the villain in the low jack who, or I think there was a limp raise, villain raise. I put in a big 3-bet because I'm in the blind.
Mhm.
My villain called. The flop was jack high and pretty dry.
Okay.
I, so let's say jack 8-2. And I bet I like a quarter pot or something like that.
Okay.
And villain said, he kind of shakes his head, like he can't believe what's going on and says, what the fuck is that? You bet 150 on the flop and then $60 on the turn. What could you possibly have that would do that? It looks to me like you have ace king and are just praying that I fold, but I can beat ace king. And then he calls.
Hmm.
Oh, and then the turn is, I don't remember. It was a 4.
Yeah.
And so then I bet 125% pot
Hmm.
and he folded.
Yeah. I mean, that's completely reasonable. And in particular, the reason it's reasonable has absolutely nothing to do with anything he said at any point in the hand. The reason it's reasonable is because ace king is just a pretty decent bluffing combination on that run out. If it's jack eight deuce
Mhm.
4, because you're putting a lot of pressure on his middle pocket pairs. You have outs against top pair. You also have blockers to some of the top pairs and so on. So that's a completely reasonable, very, very appropriate bluffing combo. And it's a bluff that, you know, you can and should take that spot against anybody, regardless of any kind of table talk or anything like that.
Yep.
And I don't, I think truly in most of the cases like that, when people are interacting at the table in that kind of way, it's all performative anyway. It's all just designed to try to engineer a specific action from you. And in a lot of cases, the more talking they're doing, the more likely it is that they just don't want you to put in many more chips. So the only thing that him talking like that would make me do is potentially just be even more keen to just bluff at a higher frequency.
Mhm.
But ace king is a good bluff candidate there. It's a very reasonable one. And yeah, I think that's good. I think that those are the types of spots that I want us to make sure that we discuss more because we want to be able to identify in that specific spot what are our turn bluffs? Why exactly is it that ace king makes a good bluff in that spot? There are a bunch of reasons, but if we can just hone in on identifying how we're constructing, particularly on turns. I think for rivers now, you know, a lot of the river dynamics are going to depend on what happens on the turn. So for now, I think it's probably more useful to hone in on the turn and really specifically identify what are our second barrels, what are our sizings going to be, and various things like that. So let's put some energy specifically into the turn for a while, and
Okay.
let's identify, you know, maybe any time that you play how about this? Next session or next couple of sessions before we get together, take a note of any time you take an aggressive action on the turn, whether it's bet, raise, whatever. Anytime you're taking
Okay.
aggressive actions on the turn, let's pay attention to
Specifically
that.
with bluffs or bluffs and value.
Any aggressive action on the turn, just so that we can have
Okay.
hands to analyze. And then what we'll do is we'll make sure that, first of
Okay.
all, we'll make sure that your value range is playing in a way that is consistent, that would make sense with your bluffs. And then we'll also look at how you're selecting your bluffs so that we can kind of iron out any construction errors that might be happening. Cool.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds